I think one of the key arguments to be aware of going into this is that New York is now one of only 14 states still imposing an estate tax. And one of only 18 states that still have any kind of tax that could be called a death tax, including states with inheritance taxes. Now, the map of death tax policies is to my left here, you're right. And note that most of the states are blank. That means they have no such tax. There's been a big shift in the landscape of estate taxation in the last 15 years or so in the wake of changes to federal policy. It used to be that every state had some form of estate or inheritance tax or both. Now, a shrinking minority of states have any such tax. Essentially, there have been debates for decades on the national level over the appropriateness of having a state tax, over whether they were morally justified or unjustified, whether they hurt the economy or not. Basically, the nation arrived at basically a political consensus and compromise on this issue. After the estate tax was phased down to a lower level and in fact temporarily repealed in 2010, President Obama and Congress reached agreement on a plan that revives and creates a new permanent federal estate tax that starts at state levels of currently $5.34 million. And that results in the filing of about 3,700 federal estate tax returns a year as of last year. In states like New York that still retain an estate tax, the estate tax is based on an old federal tax that kicks in at a much lower level of $1 million in assets or more. With the result that in New York alone, in 2012-13, more estate tax returns were filed than were filed nationally for the federal estate tax. That's how much broader the reach of our estate tax is. There's 3 points we'd like to make today. First of all, far from being limited to what we would think of as the super wealthy, the estate tax hits a growing number of middle and upper middle class households and small businesses and farmers. And in fact, there's a couple of instances we cite in support of that. One is there's a statistic about how many people in New York have assets of $1 million or more. When we have debates in Albany about millionaires and about so-called millionaire taxes, for instance, almost invariably people are referring to the number of people who earn $1 million of income. But in fact, the dictionary meaning of millionaire and the estate tax meaning of millionaire is somebody who has $1 million in assets. That is, what's their home worth, what's their life insurance worth, what's saved up in their IRA, what's their business worth if they own one of their other property equipment if they own a farm. And in that case, there's well over 500,000 New Yorkers who have a piece of, who share in assets of $1 million or more. Keeping in mind that there's 430,000 households with investable assets of $1 million or more, including married spouses. That means 600,000 or more adult New Yorkers who share in assets of $1 million or more. There's over 3,100 family farms worth $1 million or more, or farms in general. That was as of 2007. It's probably increased to some extent since then. The value per acre of farmland has doubled in the past 12 or 13 years. And then it includes people who own small businesses, even a relatively a small business returning even a relatively modest amount of net income to its owners can be worth over $1 million depending on what industry it's in. Last but not least, there are New Yorkers who have $1 million in assets by dint of having purchased a home, perhaps for a modest amount, 20 or 30 years ago, especially in downstate New York principally. That's now worth over $1 million. In most cases, these are older people who own their home for 20 or 30 years, but it also affects many people who would probably consider themselves middle class, who bought a home in the last 10 years or so that has skyrocketed in value. One example of this would be Mayor Bill de Blasio in New York City, who bought his house for $700,000 in 2006 and now owns a home worth over $1.4 million, according to tax assessments. So the estate tax doesn't just hit the so-called super rich. It hits a lot of people who have $1 million in assets, but undoubtedly think of themselves as middle class, including farmers and small business owners whose incomes don't even approach 7 figures. And this ultimately is a competitive issue for New York. Again, that's the map of estate taxation. Look at all the blanks on that map. There's only, after Tennessee's tax disappears in a few years, which is an inheritance tax actually, there's only one southern state that will still have an estate tax. There are no southwestern states, very few, no Rocky Mountain states, less than half the upper Midwest, and California has no estate tax. So people who want to avoid the estate tax by moving, if they can, have plenty of options. Now, some of the people we're going to talk about here today are people who are more literally or figuratively rooted in New York, who don't have that option. And that's part of the final irony of this debate. The debate often focuses misleadingly on people we would think of as the very rich or the super wealthy. Those are the people who actually have the greatest ability to plan their way out of the estate tax, to minimize it, or to simply move because they have multiple residents and a lot of choices in life. The people who are really stuck are people who actually don't have incomes that are that high, whose incomes or livelihoods are rooted more deeply in New York State, and find it harder to avoid the tax by moving. So there's a lot of issues involved in this, but in the final analysis, the argument, the moral or political argument over the desirability of an estate tax has pretty much become a settled issue on the national level. The settled issue is that we have an estate tax on the federal level, but it applies to only the very, very largest estates at a lower rate than it used to. There's only 14 states that still have it, and we're an outlier. And for all practical purposes, it makes sense for us not to continue to maintain a tax that simply gives people an excuse to, as Governor Cuomo has put it, move to die. The governor's not proposing repealing the tax, he's proposing raising the threshold from $1 million to the federal level and reducing the rate, and this would be a large step toward the goal of repealing the tax.